In 1941, Britain was pouring millions of pounds into the most ambitious bombing campaign in history. Every single night, hundreds of heavy bombers lifted off from airfields across eastern England, flew for hours through freezing darkness, through searchlights, through anti-aircraft fire, and dropped their bombs on what their crews believed were German factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. Thousands of young men were losing their lives in these missions. The British public was told that the Reich's industrial heartland was burning. The War Cabinet believed it. Bomber Command believed it. Everyone believed it. Then a 27-year-old economist named David Bensusan Butt opened a filing cabinet full of aerial photographs and proved that almost all of it was a lie. His classified report revealed a truth so devastating that senior commanders tried to bury it. Of every 5 bombers that set out to strike a target in Germany, only one actually dropped its bombs within 5 miles of the aiming point. 5 miles, an area of 75 square miles of mostly empty countryside. Over the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, and the most important target of all, the number dropped to 1 in 10. The rest of the bombs were falling on fields, forests, and empty villages. Entire squadrons were flying into the most dangerous skies on Earth and accomplishing nothing. Britain's strategic bombing campaign, the single most expensive military operation the country had ever undertaken, was a catastrophic failure, and thousands of aircrew were paying for that failure with their lives. But there was one man who had a solution, a 32-year-old Australian, the most brilliant navigator of his generation, a record-breaking pilot, a man who had literally written the textbook on aerial navigation. His plan was simple, logical, and obvious: create an elite force of the best crews in Bomber Command. Send them ahead of the main wave, have them find the target and mark it with colored flares. Then everyone else bombs the markers instead of guessing in the dark. The answer was right there, but the establishment said no. They called him too young, too arrogant, too Australian, not one of us. His name was Don Bennett. And this is the story of how one man, rejected, undermined, and deliberately sabotaged by his own commanders, built the force that transformed Bomber Command from an expensive disaster into the most devastating striking power of the Second World War. Donald Clifford Tyndall Bennett was born on the 14th of September, 1910, in Toowoomba, Queensland, a cattle country town on the edge of the Australian outback. He was the youngest of 4 sons. His father was a stock and station agent, his mother English-born. The household was strict Methodist. Bennett never drank, never smoked, and was never once heard to swear in his entire life. He left school without any particular academic distinction and spent time working as a jackaroo on his father's cattle property, riding horses and mending fences under the Queensland sun. Nothing about this beginning suggested what was coming. At 17, he applied to the Royal Australian Air Force. They rejected him on medical grounds. Most young men would have taken the hint. Bennett took a train to Melbourne and applied again 12 months later at a different recruiting office. This time he got in. He trained at RAF Point Cook on de Havilland Moths and Westland Wapitis, finished second in theory and first in practical flying. Within a year, he transferred to the Royal Air Force in Britain on a short service commission, joining fighter and flying boat squadrons. And then something remarkable happened. By the time Bennett left the RAF in 1935, at the age of just 25, he held a first-class navigator's license, a wireless operator's license, 3 categories of ground engineer's license, a commercial pilot's license, and a flying instructor's certificate. He could fly any aircraft in the inventory, navigate by stars across oceans, strip a wireless set down to its components, and rebuild an engine from scratch, Arthur Harris, the man who would later become his greatest obstacle, admitted that Bennett had a most unusual memory and could pick up a book on some highly technical subject and master it in an astonishingly short time. But Bennett did not just master other people's knowledge, he created his own. Together with his Swiss-born wife Elsa, he wrote The Complete Air Navigator, a comprehensive textbook on aerial navigation that was published in 1936 and became the definitive reference work in its field. It ran through 7 editions over 3 decades. Every serious pilot and navigator in the British Commonwealth trained with Bennett's book in their hands. He was 25 years old when he wrote it. One standard assessment of Bennett from this period calls him one of the most brilliant technical airmen of his generation, an outstanding pilot, a superb navigator who was also capable of stripping a wireless set or overhauling an engine. This was not a man who specialized in one thing. This was a man who could do everything and do it better than the specialists. After leaving the RAF, Bennett joined Imperial Airways and immediately found himself at the controls of one of the most extraordinary flying machines ever built. The short Mayo composite was an ingenious, slightly mad solution to a real engineering problem. A small 4-engine seaplane called Mercury sat mounted on top of a larger flying boat called Maya. The idea was simple. Maya would carry Mercury into the air with a full fuel load that Mercury could never lift on its own, then release it mid-flight to continue across the Atlantic. On the 21st of July 1938, Bennett separated Mercury over Foynes, Ireland, pointed the nose west, and flew non-stop to Montreal, Canada. 20 hours and 21 minutes in the air, covering 2,930 miles. It was the first commercial non-stop east-to-west transatlantic crossing by a heavier-than-air machine. Bennett had just made aviation history. He was 27. 3 months later, he did something even more impressive. On the 6th of October, Bennett took Mercury from Dundee, Scotland, and flew non-stop all the way to Alexander Bay on the Orange River in South Africa. 6,045 miles in roughly 42 hours. He had been aiming for Cape Town but ran short of fuel 390 miles from his destination. It did not matter. He had just set the world long-distance record for seaplanes, a record that has never been broken. When war came, Bennett's navigational genius made him indispensable in a way nobody had anticipated. In July of 1940, Lord Beaverbrook put him in charge of the Atlantic Ferry Organization, a desperate scheme to fly American-built aircraft directly across the ocean to Britain, instead of shipping them by sea, where German submarines were sending them to the bottom. Most experts said it could not be done, that regular transatlantic ferry flights were too dangerous, too unreliable, and that the weather over the North Atlantic would make consistent operations impossible. Bennett proved them wrong on the 10th of November, 1940, when he personally led the inaugural formation of 7 Lockheed Hudson bombers from Gander, Newfoundland to Aldergrove, Northern Ireland. He was the sole navigator in the lead aircraft, with 6 bombers following in formation behind him, across 2,000 miles of open ocean in winter, with no diversion airfields and no room for error. All 7 aircraft arrived safely. The historian Carl Christie later wrote that there is no doubt Bennett was the single most important individual launching the transatlantic air service. By the end of the war, the route Bennett pioneered had delivered over 9,000 aircraft to Britain, planes that might otherwise have taken weeks by sea if they survived the U-boats at all. By 1941, Don Bennett was arguably the finest navigator alive. He had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times when most pilots had never seen it. He had set world records. He had written the book, literally, that trained every navigator in the Commonwealth. And he was about to discover that none of it would be enough to overcome the one obstacle no amount of skill could solve: the pride of the British military establishment. The man who exposed the truth was not a pilot, not a soldier, and not anyone the Air Ministry would have chosen for the job. David Ben-Susan Butt was a 27-year-old Cambridge economist who had studied under John Maynard Keynes and even helped index Keynes's famous general theory. He was working as a civil servant in the War Cabinet Secretariat, a quiet analytical mind in a world of uniforms and medals. His boss was Lord Cherwell, also known as Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's closest scientific advisor and a man who trusted numbers more than generals. Cherwell had grown suspicious. The reports coming back from Bomber Command were glowing. Targets found, factories hit, mission successful. But the war was not going the way those reports suggested. German production was not collapsing. Something did not add up. So Cherwell gave Butt a simple task: go through the actual photographic evidence and find out what was really happening. The evidence came from cameras mounted inside the bombers themselves, triggered automatically by the bomb release mechanism. At the moment the bombs left the aircraft, a photo flash bomb producing roughly 500 million candle power would fire, illuminating the ground below for a fifth of a second, just long enough for the camera to capture exactly where the aircraft was when it released its payload. Butt examined 633 of these photographs, covering 28 targets across 48 nights of operations between June and July of 1941. What he found was a disaster hiding in plain sight. Over French ports, the easiest, closest targets, 2 out of 3 crews got within 5 miles. That was the best result. Over Germany as a whole, only 1 in 4 managed it. On nights with a full moon and clear skies, 2 in 5. On dark nights with no moon, 1 in 15. And those numbers only counted aircraft whose crews actually claimed to have attacked. Of the 6,103 bombers dispatched during the period Butt studied, over 2,000 never even reported reaching their targets. When you factored in the total number of aircraft that took off, the real figure was staggering. Barely 1 in 5 bombers that left England dropped anything within 5 miles of where it was supposed to land. The report was classified most secret and dated the 18th of August, 1941. Its conclusions exceeded even Cherwell's worst fears. Sir Richard Pearse, the man commanding Bomber Command at the time, refused to accept any of it. He called the findings unacceptable and responded not with reform, but with defiance. On the 7th of November, 1941, Pearse launched the largest bombing raid of the war to that point. Nearly 400 bombers sent to Berlin, despite forecast severe weather and a formal objection from one of his own senior officers. The raid was a catastrophe. Of 169 aircraft sent to the capital, only 79 reached the target area. 37 bombers were lost in a single night, more than double the previous record, with virtually nothing to show for it. Pearse was removed from command within weeks, but the damage went far beyond one failed raid. The Butt report had given ammunition to everyone who believed strategic bombing was a waste of lives and resources. The Royal Navy wanted the heavy bombers converted to maritime patrol. The Army wanted the production capacity redirected to tanks and artillery. Senior scientists argued that the only real benefit of the bombing campaign was tying up German air defenses, and you could achieve that with a fraction of the force. The entire future of Bomber Command was hanging by a thread. The response came in 2 parts. First, a new directive, issued on the 14th of February 1942, formally authorized area bombing of German cities, accepting that if bombers could not hit specific factories, they would instead target entire urban areas. 8 days later, a new commander arrived to carry out that directive. His name was Arthur Harris, and he was about to collide with Don Bennett in a battle that would shape the rest of the air war. But before the political war began, Bennett had already proven something that no amount of rank or seniority could buy, the kind of physical courage that makes other men follow you without question. On the night of the 27th of April, 1942, Wing Commander Bennett led a formation of Halifax bombers from No. 10 Squadron on one of the most dangerous missions of the war, a direct attack on the German battleship Tirpitz, the most powerful warship in the European theatre, hiding in Fettenfjord, near Trondheim, Norway. The fjord was narrow, ringed by mountains, and bristling with anti-aircraft guns. The Tirpitz itself was shielded by a defensive smokescreen. Bennett's aircraft was hit multiple times by ground fire on the approach. His tail gunner, Flight Lieutenant Howe, was badly wounded. The aircraft was on fire. Any reasonable pilot would have turned for home. Bennett went around for a second bombing run. He released his payload, then turned east toward neutral Sweden, the only possible escape route. The aircraft was breaking apart. One crew member, gripped by panic, announced that it was all over. Bennett told him, very firmly, to shut up and not to be a fool. He held the burning aircraft steady long enough for the wounded gunner to be helped out of his turret and assisted with his parachute. Then Bennett jumped himself, just moments before the aircraft came apart in the sky. He landed in darkness, in deep snow, somewhere in the Norwegian wilderness. Within minutes he stumbled into another figure in the dark. Both men froze, each convinced the other was a German soldier. Then Bennett recognized the voice of his own wireless operator, Sergeant Forbes. He called out that it was his wing commander, and the two men began walking. What followed was a grueling trek through snow-covered mountains, guided by Norwegian civilians who risked everything to help them. A villager named Ryder Fordal recovered Bennett's buried parachute and Mae West life jacket, hiding them from German patrols for the duration of the war. Bennett and Forbes made it across the border into Sweden, and from there back to Britain. He arrived home exactly 1 month after being shot down. Instead of reporting to London for debriefing as required, he hitched a ride in a small Anson aircraft straight to RAF Leeming, where his wife and family were waiting. The intelligence officers were furious. Bennett could not have cared less. All 7 crew members survived that night. 4 escaped to Sweden. 3 were captured but lived through the war. Bennett received the Distinguished Service Order for the mission. There is one detail that says more about the man than any medal citation ever could. A photograph of the Tirpitz hung in Bennett's office for the rest of the war, a reminder of unfinished business. And in 1992, 50 years after that night over the fjord, Bennett's widow travelled to Trondheim for the anniversary. There, Reidar Fordal, the Norwegian villager, presented her with the Mae West he had kept hidden for half a century, hoping one day to return it to Bennett personally. Bennett had passed away 6 years earlier. The life jacket was donated to the Australian War Memorial, where it remains today. This was the man the RAF establishment was about to call too young and too inexperienced to lead. Arthur Harris took command of Bomber Command on the 22nd of February 1942 with a reputation for bluntness and an iron will. He inherited the crisis the Butt Report had created, a force hemorrhaging credibility and facing calls for dismemberment. His response was area bombing. If you cannot hit a single factory, flatten the entire city around it. But even area bombing required the bombers to find the right city. And a growing number of voices at the Air Ministry were saying the only answer was a specialist target finding force. The loudest of those voices belonged to Group Captain Sidney Bufton, Deputy Director of Bomber Operations, a former squadron commander who had studied exactly how the Luftwaffe achieved its devastating accuracy over Coventry. On the 14th of November, 1940, the German Kampfgruppe 100 had used specialist Pathfinder aircraft to drop incendiary markers ahead of the main wave. The following bombers simply aimed at the fires. The result was the near-total destruction of Coventry's city centre. Bufton argued that Bomber Command needed to learn from its enemy. He proposed a target-finding force, 6 squadrons of the best crews, enriched with 40 of the most experienced navigators in the command, trained specifically to find and mark targets for the rest. Harris opposed it with everything he had. His arguments were specific and forceful. An elite unit would breed jealousy and resentment throughout the rest of the command. It would drain the best crews from every group, weakening morale across the board. Each group should develop its own target-finding capability rather than handing the responsibility to outsiders. The existing system, where the best squadrons simply led the attack, was already adequate. To build a wall of opposition, Harris convened 3 separate conferences with his group commanders, ensuring that every senior officer in Bomber Command lined up behind him. He treated Bufton, a mere group captain daring to challenge the commander-in-chief, with open contempt. In his letter to Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal on the 2nd of June 1942, Harris described the outcome of his conferences with barely concealed scorn. Every group commander was utterly opposed to the formation of a target-finding force, he wrote. The only person who disagreed was an ex-squadron commander from Feltwell, now on 3-group staff. But he could offer no reasoned argument beyond asserting that he wanted to find the target as often as possible. Harris added that this naive statement received the chorused reply of, "And so say all of us." It was a masterful piece of political management. Harris had turned a technical debate into a loyalty test and made sure everyone passed, but Portal was not impressed. On the 14th of June, he sent Harris a devastating point-by-point rebuttal. Without close association between specialist crews, there could be no continuity of technique, Portal wrote. There could be no day-to-day improvement of method, and the command could not ensure that plans and briefings were similarly and clearly interpreted by the force as a whole. Sir Henry Tizard, one of Britain's most respected scientists, demolished the morale argument with a single sentence that cut through all of Harris's careful politicking. He said that he did not think the formation of a first 15 at rugby union made little boys play any less enthusiastically. Harris was unmoved. It took a direct order, Eustace, from the Prime Minister himself, relayed through the Chief of the Air Staff, to force his hand. The Pathfinder force would be created, whether Harris liked it or not. And if Harris could not prevent the Pathfinder force from existing, he would make absolutely sure it existed on his terms. He chose Bennett to lead it, not as an act of generosity, but as an act of control. Bennett recorded the conversation in his memoir. Harris told him bluntly that whilst he was opposed to the Pathfinder force and would waste no effort on it, he would support Bennett personally in every way. Bennett's own bitter assessment, written years later, was precise. He said that this assurance was carried out to the letter and in the spirit from then on to the end of the war, and that Harris never really gave the Pathfinders a fair chance. The sabotage began immediately. Bennett should have been appointed at Air Commodore rank, the standard for a group-level commander. Instead, Harris made him an acting group captain, 2 full ranks below what the job demanded. This was not an oversight. It meant Bennett would operate as a staff officer under Harris's direct authority, without the independence that every other group commander enjoyed. The Pathfinder force was denied its own headquarters and instead given administrative lodgings with 3 Group, making it dependent on another commander's goodwill for everything from supplies to personnel. Then came the equipment. Bennett wanted an all-Lancaster and Mosquito force, the 2 best aircraft in the infantry, capable of reaching any target in Germany at the altitudes required for accurate marking. What he actually received was a deliberate mismatch designed to prove the concept could not work. 5 squadrons were assembled, one pulled from each existing group, flying 4 completely different aircraft types. Number 156 Squadron arrived with obsolescent Vickers Wellingtons, twin-engine medium bombers that belonged to the early years of the war, not to a cutting-edge pathfinding unit in 1942. Number 7 Squadron brought short Stirlings, the worst of Britain's 4-engine heavies, with a notoriously low operational ceiling that made them dangerously vulnerable to flak and fundamentally unsuitable for leading attacks at high altitude. Number 35 Squadron had Halifaxes. Only number 83 Squadron had Lancasters, the one aircraft Bennett actually wanted. This was not a fighting force. It was a bureaucratic compromise assembled to fail. Harris then delivered the final blow. He insisted that operations begin on the very same day the squadrons assembled, the 15th of August, 1942. There would be no training period, no time to develop procedures, no opportunity for crews from 5 different squadrons, flying 4 different aircraft, to learn how to work together. He also refused to use the Air Ministry's proposed name, Target Finding Force, purely because it was their idea. He renamed it the Pathfinder Force, a petty assertion of ownership over something he had never wanted. Harris's published assessment of Bennett captures the relationship perfectly. Praise wrapped in poison. He called Bennett the most efficient airman he had ever met, but added that being still a young man, Bennett had the young intellectual's habit of underrating experience and overrating knowledge. He acknowledged that Bennett's courage, both moral and physical, was outstanding, and that as a technician, he was unrivaled, but could not resist noting that Bennett could not suffer fools gladly, and by his own high standards, there were many fools. Bennett was 20 years younger than every other group commander. He was Australian, in an institution where accent and background determined everything. He saw his own appointment with characteristic bluntness as a victory for the players over the gentlemen. He had 3 days before his first operation, 3 days to take 5 mismatched squadrons with no shared training, no established procedures, and no proper equipment, and prove that the most powerful man in Bomber Command was wrong. The first test came on the night of the 18th of August, 1942, just 3 days after the squadrons had assembled. The target was Flensburg, a port city near the Danish border. It was a humiliation. Strong winds that the meteorologists had failed to predict pushed the entire bomber stream north. Pathfinder crews, navigating with nothing more than dead reckoning and astronavigation, the same crude methods that had produced the Butt Report disaster, dropped their markers on Danish towns instead of Flensburg. The main force bombed the markers obediently, scattering high explosives across the wrong country. Harris and his group commanders were delighted. Here was the proof they had been waiting for. The Pathfinder concept was a failure, just as they had predicted. Bennett did not waste a single hour feeling sorry for himself. He knew exactly what had gone wrong, and he knew the problem was not the concept, it was the tools. His crews had been sent into battle with no specialist equipment, no training time, and no marking techniques beyond dropping ordinary incendiaries and hoping the main force could see them. Everything had to be built from scratch. Over the following weeks and months, Bennett and his staff developed an entirely new system of target marking, a layered approach designed to solve every problem the first raids had exposed. The techniques were given names drawn from the home cities of the multinational officers who helped create them. New Haven, named for the English port, was visual ground marking used on clear nights. Illuminator aircraft would drop parachute flares to light up the target area. Then visual markers would identify the precise aiming point through their bomb sights and drop colored target indicator bombs directly onto it. The main force would bomb on those markers. Parramatta, named for Bennett's own home region near Sydney, was blind ground marking used when cloud obscured the target. Aircraft equipped with H-2S radar would identify the target on their screens and drop target indicators through the overcast. Musical Parramatta substituted oboe-guided mosquitoes for even greater accuracy. Wanganui, named for a New Zealand town, was sky marking, the last resort when thick cloud made ground marking impossible. Parachute flares would be dropped above the cloud layer, and the main force would aim at the suspended lights. Musical Wanganui combined this with oboe guidance. But the real innovation was the layered system that made these techniques work under combat conditions. First came the illuminators, dropping flares to reveal the target. Then the primary markers, placing target indicators on the aiming point. Behind them came the backers up, crews whose sole job was to refresh the markers as they burned out, maintaining the aiming point throughout the raid. And finally, recenterers would correct for drift, dropping fresh markers on the original point when bombing inevitably crept short. This creep back, the natural tendency of crews to release their bombs a fraction early during the terrifying straight and level bombing run, was the single greatest threat to accuracy. Against Berlin, it would eventually stretch the bombing pattern across 30 miles of countryside behind the target. Bennett was building something that had never existed before, a precision guidance system made of human beings, flying through the most dangerous airspace on Earth, replacing and correcting each other in real time. All he needed now were the technologies to make it work. 3 technologies arrived in rapid succession that would give Bennett's system its teeth. The first was oboe, the most accurate bombing aid of the entire war. Developed by Alec Reeves at Standard Telephones and Cables, it used 2 ground radar stations in southern England, codenamed Cat and Mouse. Cat transmitted a radar beam that guided the aircraft along a precise circular arc passing through the target. The pilot listened to Morse code signals in his headphones. Continuous dots meant he was drifting too close. Dashes meant too far. When both signals merged into a steady tone, he was on track, flying along a corridor just 35 yards wide. Meanwhile, Mouse measured the aircraft's distance along that arc. At the exact calculated release point, a coded signal was transmitted, and the bombs fell. The accuracy was extraordinary, approximately 50 yards at a range of 250 miles. But oboe had strict limitations. Only 1 aircraft could use each station pair at a time, and a marking run took 10 minutes. Its line of sight requirement limited range to roughly 270 miles, enough to reach the Ruhr, but nowhere near enough for Berlin. It first saw operational use on the 20th of December, 1942. The second was H-2S, the world's first airborne ground mapping radar. Using a cavity magnetron transmitter and a rotating antenna mounted beneath the aircraft, it painted a crude but usable map of the terrain below on a cathode ray screen. Built-up areas returned bright echoes. Water appeared dark. Unlike oboe, H-2S was entirely self-contained. No ground stations required, no range limit. It was particularly devastating over coastal cities, where the sharp contrast between land and water made identification almost unmistakable. Hamburg, sitting on the River Elbe near the North Sea coast, would become the perfect H-2S target. Its weakness was that it transmitted actively, and from late 1943, German night fighters fitted with Naxos detectors could home in on H-2S emissions from 20 miles away. First operational on the 30th of January, 1943. The third was the target indicator bomb itself, the physical marker that made the entire system visible. A standard 250-pound bomb casing packed with 60 colored pyrotechnic candles, ejected by a barometric fuse at a preset altitude. On impact, a ground-burst target indicator created a pool of intense colored fire, roughly 100 yards across. The Germans called them Christmas trees. They burned for approximately 3 minutes before needing renewal, which was why the backers up roll was so critical. Available in red, green, and yellow, with unique combinations like red with green stars, they were designed to resist German attempts to light decoy markers nearby. And then there was the master bomber, the most dangerous job in Bomber Command. A single senior officer orbiting directly over the target for the entire duration of the raid, directing the attack by radio in real time. He would assess which markers were accurate and which had drifted, call out instructions to the main force, bomb on the red markers, ignore the greens, shift your aim 200 yards north, and keep correcting as conditions changed. The concept was first used over Peenemünde on the 17th of August, 1943, when Group Captain John Searby of No. 83 Squadron circled the heavily defended V-weapon research center for 30 minutes, while over 20 bombers were shot down around him. When the initial markers fell 2 miles off target, Searby identified a well-placed yellow indicator and redirected the entire attack onto it. He received an immediate Distinguished Service Order. The master bomber became standard practice from that night forward. Bennett now had the tools, the techniques, and the people. What came next would prove everything. The proof came over the Ruhr, the target that had defeated Bomber Command for 3 years. The Ruhr Valley was Germany's industrial fortress, a dense concentration of steelworks, coal mines, and armaments factories stretching from Essen to Dortmund. It was also permanently shrouded in a thick haze of industrial smoke and pollution that made visual identification virtually impossible. Before the Pathfinders, bombing the Ruhr had been little more than guesswork. Now oboe-equipped mosquitoes of No. 109 Squadron could cut through that haze with electronic precision. The opening blow fell on the 5th of March, 1943. 442 aircraft set course for Essen, home of the Krupp armaments empire and the most heavily defended city in Germany. 8 oboe mosquitoes were tasked with marking. 3 turned back with equipment failures. But the 5 that reached Essen placed their target indicators directly on the center of the city. The main force bombed accurately for the first time in 3 years of trying. Even Harris, the man who had fought against the Pathfinder's creation, acknowledged what had happened. He called this raid the precise moment when Bomber Command's main offensive began. A later strike on Essen, on the 25th of July, inflicted more damage in a single night than every previous attack on the city combined. Goebbels recorded in his diary that there had been a complete stoppage of production in the Krupp works. Then came Hamburg, and the most devastating demonstration of what Pathfinder-guided bombing could achieve. Operation Gomorrah, launched on the 24th of July, 1943, combined H-2S marking with a new countermeasure called Window. Thousands of aluminium foil strips dropped from aircraft to blind German radar. Hamburg's position on the Elbe estuary made it the ideal H-2S target. The sharp contrast between water and city was unmistakable on the radar screens. On the night of the 27th of July, between 550 and 600 aircraft dropped their bombs into a concentrated area of roughly 2 miles by 1 mile in just 30 minutes. What followed was something no one had predicted. The concentrated bombing created a firestorm, a self-sustaining inferno where the heat generated winds of up to 240 kilometers per hour, feeding oxygen into a core where temperatures reached 800 degrees. Approximately 37,000 people lost their lives in a single night. 180,000 were wounded. 60% of the city's housing was destroyed. Over 1 million civilians fled. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later told the Führer that 6 more attacks of this scale against different cities could bring German war production to a complete halt. 1 month later, on the 17th of August, the Pathfinders guided 596 bombers against Peenemünde, the secret research facility on the Baltic coast, where Germany was developing its V-2 rocket. The raid, directed in real time by the first master bomber, succeeded in eliminating 2 key rocket scientists and forcing the entire program into dispersal, delaying it by critical weeks. In the space of 6 months, Bennett's force had gone from marking the wrong country to enabling the 3 most consequential raids of the entire bombing campaign. The numbers tell the full story. In 1941, roughly 5% of bombers setting out from England dropped their loads within 5 miles of the target. By the time the Pathfinders formed in August 1942, that figure had risen to 24% within 3 miles. During the Battle of the Ruhr in 1943, oboe-guided marking pushed accuracy to 73% within 5 kilometers. By 1945, 95% of missions met RAF accuracy parameters. That transformation from catastrophic futility to precision cost everything. Over 40 months, the Pathfinder force flew 50,490 sorties against roughly 3,440 targets. At least 3,727 members lost their lives on operations. Pathfinder crews flew 45 consecutive operations without a break, compared to 30 for main force crews. The original tour length was set at 60, but it proved virtually impossible to survive. 50 new crews were needed every single month just to replace losses. In the first month alone, loss rates averaged over 9% per raid. 3 Pathfinder air crew received the Victoria Cross, squadron leaders Bazalgette, Palmer, and Swales, all of them awarded posthumously. The system had its limits, and Berlin exposed them brutally. The capital lay far beyond oboe range. On H2S screens, the massive inland city, with no coastline, no river estuary, appeared as an amorphous grey blob, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding countryside. Terrible winter weather, a 600-mile route through strengthened German defences, and the sheer scale of the city made accurate marking close to impossible. Over 16 major raids between November 1943 and March 1944, more than 1,000 bombers were lost. The campaign culminated in the Nuremberg disaster, 94 aircraft out of 795 lost in a single night. Berlin was damaged but never broken. It was a strategic failure, but it was a failure of technology and distance, not of the men who flew into those skies. By the war's end, Bennett commanded 19 squadrons. He held the acting rank of Air Vice Marshal at the age of 33, the youngest officer in RAF history ever to reach that rank. And his Mosquitoes, the aircraft that experts had called impossible to fly at night, were suffering a loss rate of just 1.1%. Arthur Harris received a baronetcy, the rank of Marshal of the Royal Air Force, and a bronze statue outside the RAF church on the Strand. Don Bennett, the only bomber group commander denied a knighthood, flew the first aircraft out of Heathrow, built an airline, lost it, served 73 days in Parliament, and wrote a memoir so honest it triggered a libel suit. He passed away on the 15th of September, 1986, Battle of Britain Day, one day after his 76th birthday. The historian Alan Stevens would later call him Australia's greatest military leader. Bennett needed no statue. He had already written his own epitaph, that Great Britain had strangely failed to erect any Nelson's column in memory of Bomber Command, the most powerful striking force in all British history.